The gramophone crackled as Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade swept across the open yard. Beneath the watchful eyes of a dozen stunned American guards and hundreds of silent German POWs, a woman in a threadbare uniform stood frozen near the edge of the mess hall. And then he offered her a hand. A young Texas corporal, boots dusty from the Oklahoma soil he grew up on, took a single step forward and said, "May I?" The woman hesitated. Then she nodded. What followed was not a rebellion, not even a statement, just a slow, swaying dance, clumsy at first, surreal to all. But within seconds, jaws dropped. A U.S. soldier was dancing with the enemy, not just any prisoner, a German woman. The music floated on. She smiled. He laughed. Someone dropped their coffee. A sergeant barked, "What the hell is that?" But nobody moved. In that strange quiet, the war slipped for a moment. And something dangerous bloomed. Humanity. The camp would never be the same. Before that unlikely victory could ever unfold, the camp ran like clockwork, a world defined by whistles, fences, and forms. Tucked into the wide plains of the American Midwest, the compound held over 600 German women behind neat rows of barbed wire. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, no rifles, no combat boots, no medals. Most had served as secretaries, radio operators, clerks, and nurses in a war machine that had long since collapsed. Now, stripped of insignia and reduced to numbers, they were expected to disappear into the background of a tightly run American prison system. And, for the most part, they did. Morning began with a bell. Not shouted orders, just the steady clang that told the camp to wake. Roll call followed, filed lines, crisp formations, names read off and checked twice. Work assignments varied. Some women scrubbed barracks floors, others sorted laundry. A few worked the kitchens, peeling potatoes and weighing out rations with the same precision they once applied to field reports. No task was glamorous, but each was enforced with bureaucratic exactness. Even leisure was scheduled. An hour in the yard, always supervised, never unsupervised conversation with guards. Rules were not just policy. They were armor. For the Americans, especially the officers in charge, there was a fear not of violence, but of contamination. These weren't male prisoners, likely to resist or riot. These were women, educated, composed, sometimes polite, sometimes flirtatious, but always dangerous in the way that emotions could be. The Army's field manual was clear. Do not become familiar. Do not make exceptions. Do not forget who is the prisoner and who is the guard. If a man spoke too long with a woman across the wire, there were consequences. If a guard handed over a chocolate, even in kindness, it was considered a breach of discipline. No touching, no favors, no names. And then came the cowboy. Corporal Jack Harris didn't wear spurs, but he might as well have. Raised on a dusty ranch outside Abilene, he had joined the Army not out of loyalty to command, but because his older brothers had done it before him. He carried himself with an easy confidence that unsettled his superiors and charmed his peers. He tipped his hat, even when no one wore them. He addressed the prisoners with a quiet civility that made the older guards uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he'd say with a drawl, handing over a mess kit or gesturing toward a work detail. Not flirtatious, never improper, just kind. Jack wasn't assigned to guard the women's barracks often, but when he was, something shifted in the air. He wasn't there to intimidate or humiliate. He watched, listened. He noticed who limped and who didn't get seconds in the mess hall. He remembered faces. It wasn't that he disrespected the rules, it was that he didn't see the point of cruelty. At first, the German women avoided his gaze. Familiarity was dangerous. A kind American could be a trick, or worse, a weakness. But Jack's tone never changed. He asked nothing, expected nothing, just did his job with a sort of quiet decency that felt alien inside the wire. The camp staff whispered. A corporal who called prisoners ladies, who stood a little too long outside the kitchen when the women passed through, who didn't leer, didn't bark orders, didn't punish mistakes. It wasn't misconduct, but it was something else entirely. Unpredictable, and unpredictability is a threat in a place built on routine. One day, Jack paused outside the mess hall, watching the prisoners file out after lunch. A woman at the back, tall, blonde, silent, dropped her spoon. It clattered against the concrete. No one moved. Then Jack bent, picked it up, and handed it to her. Their fingers almost touched. She looked at him, not with thanks, but with wary confusion. He tipped his head and walked away. That moment should have meant nothing, but it was the first broken thread in a tapestry stitched with control. Because once someone looks into the eyes of an enemy and doesn't see a threat but a person, rules start to fray. And beneath the khaki and wire, something far older than war begins to stir. She was not beautiful in the way the films back home had taught Jack to recognize. Her face was angular, her cheekbones too sharp, her mouth often pulled tight with some unspoken worry. But there was something about her stillness, the way she folded laundry with practiced grace, how her eyes didn't dart like the others, as if she already knew the limits of this place and had made peace with them. She moved like a woman who expected nothing more. The name on her file was Charlotte Hesse. But inside the wire, names had little meaning. To the Americans, she was number 312. Lotte had not joined the war to fight. She had joined to type. As a secretary for the Luftwaffe's communications division, her life in Berlin had been spent behind desks, keys clacking beneath her fingers while generals barked orders and maps bled red with advancing fronts. She had believed once. In the fatherland, in order, in duty. But belief had softened in the face of ration lines, air raid sirens, and nights spent huddled beneath stairwells as firestorms consumed the city above. She had watched buildings fall like paper. She had seen children dragged from rubble. One day her office was gone. The next, so was the Reich. When the Americans captured her, she had not resisted. The war was already over in her eyes. Now she peeled potatoes, folded shirts, scrubbed floors. The world had shrunk to tasks, to days divided into work and rest, to the strange kindness of cotton sheets and 3 daily meals. Still, the air felt off. Too clean, the sky too big, birds too loud, the guards too quiet. This place was neither prison nor paradise. It was limbo, and she didn't trust it. The other women coped in different ways. Some clung to bitterness. Others faded into silence. Lotte remained somewhere in between. She did her work, spoke little, never caused trouble. But sometimes, when she thought no one was listening, she hummed. Old songs, folk melodies, snatches of lullabies her mother used to sing in Saxony before everything changed. That was when Jack noticed her. It wasn't that he sought her out. He'd been making his rounds, clipboard tucked under one arm, boots echoing down the corridor of the laundry station. Then the sound reached him. Not words, just melody, soft, strange, almost like mourning disguised as music. He paused in the doorway and saw her standing over a steaming bucket, sleeves rolled up, arms red from scrubbing. She didn't see him. She just hummed, eyes unfocused, lost in some memory that seemed to both soothe and hollow her. Jack didn't say a word. He just watched. After that, he found himself lingering more often. Not intentionally, at least that's what he told himself. But if he was posted near the laundry, he'd slow his steps. If he passed the kitchen, he'd glance inside. He didn't speak to her, didn't want to start anything. But curiosity, like music, doesn't always need permission. Their run-ins were quiet. A tray exchanged, a door held open. Once, he dropped a pencil, and she picked it up before he could bend down. Their hands didn't touch, but their eyes did. She didn't smile. Not yet. But one afternoon, when Jack passed the laundry and nodded as always, Lotta looked up from her work, and for the first time her lips curved, just slightly. A flicker, gone in a breath. Jack walked away with a strange heat in his chest, as if he'd swallowed sunlight. He didn't know it yet, but something irreversible had begun. It began not with a grand act, but with something small. A spoon. Lotta was carrying a stack of trays from the mess when one slid sideways, clattering a single piece of cutlery to the concrete. It bounced once, then skidded to rest near Jack's boot. She froze, as if expecting some punishment for carelessness, but Jack just stooped, picked it up, and extended it to her handle first. Their eyes met. Hers were slate-gray, unreadable. His were sun-touched and calm. For a second too long, neither moved. "Ma'am," he said softly. It was the absurdity of the word that nearly made her laugh. No American had ever called her that, not since surrender, maybe not ever. She took the spoon. Their fingers brushed. It was nothing. But in a place ruled by silence and protocol, that moment whispered louder than any shout. In the following days, the air between them changed. Nothing was said, but something passed in the glances, in the way Jack's step slowed when he saw her, in the way Lotta's hands paused ever so slightly when he walked by. It was dangerous. Both of them knew that. There were rules, firm, spoken, drilled into every guard, no contact, no favors, no familiarity, and unspoken ones, too, older than the camp itself. A prisoner was not a woman. A guard was not a man. They were roles, uniforms, ranks. You didn't smile at each other. You didn't see each other, and you certainly didn't dance. But then came music night. The Americans called it relaxation morale, a chance for the guards to unwind in the empty yard behind the barracks. Someone had dragged out an old gramophone, its horn dented but still loud. A stack of records leaned nearby. Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw, even some jazz. The sun was just beginning to set, and the guards gathered slowly, clutching tin mugs of weak coffee and cans of warm beer, shuffling feet to the beat of a world far removed from barbed wire. Lotta wasn't supposed to be there. She was on her way to the supply shed when the first strains of Moonlight Serenade floated through the air. The melody curled around the buildings, threading between fences like smoke. She stopped walking. The sound was impossibly soft, impossibly sad. Not the sound of victory or occupation, but longing. Jack spotted her before she turned to leave. She was standing in the corridor between two buildings, arms tucked behind her back, eyes cast toward the dusk. Her expression was unreadable. He stepped away from the group, heart pounding in his chest like a drum. He didn't think. He just walked. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. The music filled the space between them. Then, without ceremony, he extended his hand. She stared at it as though it were a live wire, then at him. "Dance?" he asked. The word barely reached her ears. It was so ridiculous, so far outside the rules of war and peace, that for a moment she thought he was mocking her. But his face was still, open. "No one's watching," he said, though they both knew it wasn't true. She hesitated. A breath, a blink. Then she nodded. Their hands touched, the rough of his palm, the tremble in her fingers. And they stepped forward, slowly, awkwardly, swaying more than dancing. His boots moved in a hesitant rhythm. Her feet followed, cautious but certain. The gramophone didn't pause. The sky dimmed. A murmur swept the yard. Guards turned. One choked on his drink. Another muttered something under his breath. No one moved. No one stopped them. For 2 minutes and 16 seconds, time bent. The war held its breath. And in that space, they didn't speak the same language, didn't share the same country, didn't belong to the same world. But they danced. And that was the problem. Because they danced. Not for politics, not for defiance, but because something silent and human had passed between them. That, in its quietest form, was what made it dangerous. For a moment, the war stilled, and everyone knew it. From the far edge of the yard, a corporal dropped his cup. The tin clattered to the dirt like a shot fired in the dark. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence. A cigarette burned down in a man's fingers, forgotten. And there, in the orange glow of a setting sun and the scratchy hum of a gramophone, stood an American guard swaying with a German prisoner. Whispers stirred like wind through tall grass. Is he dancing with her? She's one of the prisoners, one of them. Some guards turned away, too stunned or unsure to process what they saw. Others watched with narrowed eyes, suspicion pulling at the corners of their mouths. A few stared, unmoving, caught not in outrage, but in awe. One sergeant, grizzled from the North Africa campaign, took a slow step forward. His fists were already curling at his sides. The lines on his face deepened with disbelief. He glanced at the officer on duty, waiting for the reprimand, the order, the return to order. But the officer said nothing. He just stared, lips slightly parted, as if trying to translate what his eyes were seeing into something that made sense. No one moved to stop it. Because how do you stop something like that? It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't an embrace. There was no seduction, no smirk, no overt challenge. It was a quiet, stiff-backed sway, hands barely connected, eyes cautious. It was not rebellion. It was something worse, recognition. Jack didn't even notice the silence at first. His focus was on keeping the rhythm steady, on making sure she didn't trip. Lotta's gaze never left the horizon, as if she were afraid that to look into his eyes would break the spell or reveal too much. Her body stayed distant, but she let him guide her, just barely, through the beat. The music crackled. The gramophone skipped once. Someone coughed. The sergeant stepped forward again. His mouth opened, and then he stopped. Because to interrupt would be to draw a line around something unspoken, and in doing so, give it shape, name it, make it real. There was fear in the stillness, not fear of fraternization, not fear of insubordination, but fear that something bigger had shifted, that a story every man had told himself, that enemies were separate, were incapable of softness, had just torn slightly at the edge. A few guards glanced at each other with a look that said, "I hope no one reports this." Another, younger, muttered, "They're just dancing." A third turned his back entirely, as if seeing too much might infect him. When the record ended, there was no applause, no reprimand, no laugh to cut the tension. Jack stepped back. Lotta did too. No words, no gestures, just space, restored carefully as if nothing had happened. She walked away first, head high, steps even. Jack stood still for a beat longer, then turned toward the barracks. The moment was over, but it lingered like the scent of smoke after the fire has been put out. Later that night, some guards chuckled nervously in their bunks. Others stayed quiet, lost in thought. One wrote a letter home that simply said, "Something strange happened tonight. And the officer who said nothing? He stood in his quarters, staring at the report he couldn't bring himself to write, because deep down he knew the truth. They hadn't broken the rules. The illusion, once broken, refused to be repaired. By dawn, the next morning, the camp hummed with rumor. The guards didn't speak of it openly during roll call, but the air between them felt charged, as though lightning had struck the night before and left something raw behind. Lotta was reassigned to the kitchens that same day. Officially, it was to rebalance work distribution. Unofficially, it was to remove her from the laundry and the watchful eyes of a certain corporal. Jack received 2 verbal warnings. "You know better," his sergeant said, voice low and tired. "This isn't a dance hall. Don't make it one." Jack nodded, said, "Yes, sir," and went back to his post. No formal punishment came, but everyone knew the line had been crossed, and lines, once crossed, have a way of redrawing the world around them. The whispers started small. A few of the women whispered in German, their voices careful but curious. The story shifted as stories always do. Some said the American cowboy had kissed her. Others said she had seduced him. A few, bolder than the rest, whispered that maybe it hadn't been either, that maybe it was something gentler, something they could not name. Among the Americans, the tales spread with the same velocity. "The cowboy danced with a kraut," one said with a grin. Another replied, "Hell, that boy's got nerve." A third muttered, "Or stupidity." They laughed, but the laughter never quite reached their eyes. Even humor could not mask discomfort. Jack felt it in every glance that followed him. Some guards avoided his eyes altogether, unwilling to be associated with whatever strange tenderness had taken place. Others clapped him on the back, grinning in that way men do when they want to show admiration without admitting envy. One private drawled, "You danced with the enemy, boy. Just don't let her two-step into your heart." Jack laughed, but it was a hollow sound, too sharp at the edges. The joke stung because it wasn't just teasing, it was truth disguised in laughter. For Lotta, the consequences were quieter but heavier. In the kitchen, her hands worked mechanically, peeling potatoes until her fingertips went raw. She never spoke of that night, not to the other women, not to the guards, not even in the small, cramped letters she sometimes wrote home. Her silence became its own kind of statement. It was not shame exactly, but protection. The dance had given her something she couldn't explain, and to speak of it would be to let it vanish under ridicule. The camp adjusted around them, like a body healing from a wound, but never quite forgetting the scar. Routine resumed. The same bells rang, the same fences gleamed in the sun. But something had changed, something intangible. The guards now hesitated when they looked at the women, perhaps wondering what other illusions might fracture under a single act of decency. The women, too, moved differently, a little taller, a little slower, as if the air itself carried proof that the walls between them and their captors were thinner than anyone dared admit. The officers never mentioned the incident again, but everyone knew it had been noted, not in reports, but in the way conversations would falter whenever Jack walked into a room. He had become a symbol of something no rule-book could define, disobedience not of orders, but of belief. That was more dangerous than defying command. At night, Jack lay awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The tune from the gramophone replayed in his head, its melody soft and treacherous. He wondered if she still heard it too, wherever they had moved her. He told himself it was just a dance, that it meant nothing. But the human heart has no respect for military logic. He knew it, and so did she. In the weeks that followed, the gossip faded into background noise, replaced by the endless monotony of camp life. Yet something in the rhythm of the place had shifted forever. The rules, the ones printed in manuals and posted on bulletin boards, held less power now than the unspoken story of a dance that everyone had witnessed, but no one could explain. It became part of camp folklore, half joke, half legend. And though no one dared to say it aloud, they all understood the same thing. The real danger hadn't been in the touch of hands or the swaying to forbidden music. It was in the realization that even inside a prison built to separate enemies, a single shared moment could remind them all of what it meant to be human. But humanity, once remembered, became its own burden. It was easier when the war had stripped everyone down to orders and obedience, easier to live by categories, guard and prisoner, ally and enemy, man and woman. But now, each night after the dance, those categories blurred. Jack lay awake, staring at the tin ceiling of his barracks, his mind replaying the feel of her hand in his. Lotta, in her narrow cot on the other side of the fence, did the same. Both of them trapped not just by wire, but by what could never be said aloud. Lotta tried to capture it in a letter to her sister in Dresden. She wrote on rough gray paper, her handwriting small and deliberate. "An American danced with me," she began. "I did not understand the music, but I understood the kindness." She hesitated before writing more, as if afraid the words themselves could betray her. Then she folded the letter, sealed it, and handed it to the guard assigned to collect outgoing mail. She knew the camp censors would read it, but part of her hoped, foolishly maybe, that kindness would slip past inspection. It didn't. 2 days later the letter came back to her bunk, the envelope opened and marked with a red stamp. Inappropriate content. Withheld. It was as if someone had erased a piece of her that had dared to exist for a single evening. She burned the letter behind the kitchen, watching the paper curl and blacken, the smoke rising like a ghost of words that had never been allowed to live. Jack, on his side of the line, fared no better. One rainy afternoon he sat at his desk in the administrative hut, trying to write home. He began the way he always did. Dear Ellie, his younger sister's name. He told her about the weather, the long shifts, the boredom of guard duty. But the words rang hollow. So he started again, slower this time. "I met someone," he wrote. "She reminded me of someone I knew in high school, except she was German and afraid." He stopped, stared at the sentence, then crossed it out until the paper tore. He knew better. You didn't write things like that. Not in wartime. Not when you were supposed to be the righteous one, guarding those who'd been the enemy. Even the act of describing it felt like betrayal. To his country, to the uniform, to his brothers who hadn't come home. He folded the letter anyway, tucked it into an envelope, but when the mail truck came, he didn't send it. Instead, he slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, where it stayed, unsent, until the ink began to blur. The silence grew heavier each day. They didn't speak again, not directly, but silence has its own language. A glance across the yard. A pause too long when one passed the other. The dance lived on, not in words, but in the space between them. A quiet ache neither could name. At night, Jack dreamed. Sometimes of the camp yard glowing gold in the fading light, sometimes of music echoing from nowhere. But in those dreams, Lotta's face was always clear, and her eyes were never afraid. He would wake before dawn, heart pounding, unsure if it was guilt or longing that kept him awake. Lotta's nights were no kinder. She dreamed, too, of movement, of warmth, of a life before the uniforms. And always, just before waking, she heard the sound of that record skipping, repeating the same few notes over and over, as if time itself refused to move forward. She would wake with her pillow damp, unsure if she had been crying or sweating. Both of them carried the memory like a smuggled letter, hidden, unspoken, but impossible to destroy. And though they never exchanged another word, both understood the truth of what had passed between them. It wasn't love, it wasn't rebellion. It was the unbearable weight of something too human to survive the rules of war. A month later, the order came down from command. Repatriation. A transport of prisoners would be sent east, back across the Atlantic, back to the ruins of a homeland that no longer existed as they remembered it. Among the names listed for transfer was one that made Jack's chest tighten: Charlotte Hesse, prisoner 312. He found her name scrawled in neat typewriter ink on the manifest, and for a long time he just stared at it. The war, it seemed, had one last act to perform, and this time it was departure. For the women, word of repatriation spread through the camp like the first breeze before a storm. Some wept with joy, others with dread. Freedom sounded beautiful until you realized where it led. Germany was no longer the country they had left. It was hunger, ash, and ghosts. Even the letters from home told of cities gone, of families scattered or buried. The idea of going back meant facing not only devastation, but also the guilt of having survived in comfort while others starved. Lotta folded her few possessions carefully into a small canvas bag, a pair of worn shoes, a handkerchief, a tin comb, and the plain gray blanket she'd slept under for nearly a year. She did not pack the past. There was no space for it. The kitchen where she had spent her days was now strangely quiet without her. The other women watched as she moved, saying nothing. There was no need for farewell. They all understood that the world was about to change again, and change never left room for sentiment. Jack was assigned to escort the group to the train station, a task that should have been simple, routine. But when he saw her again, lined up among the others in a row of identical coats, something in him buckled. She looked thinner, but her eyes were steady. No sign of recognition passed between them at first. Just a nod, brief and formal. The officer in charge handed Jack a clipboard. "Keep them in line. No talking," he said. Jack nodded, but the words barely registered. They rode in silence. The truck jolted along muddy roads bordered by the first hints of spring. Grass pushing through thawed soil, birds returning, life stubborn and unsentimental. Lotta sat near the back, hands folded neatly in her lap, face unreadable. Every so often she glanced out the window, but her gaze wasn't on the scenery. It was on the distance itself, as though she were already gone. When they reached the platform, the women filed out one by one. American soldiers handed out small parcels, rations, soap, paper. The train engine hissed, white steam curling into the cold air. Jack stood by the line, calling out numbers, ticking boxes, performing the ritual of departure. When he reached her, she stepped forward without a word. Her name left his lips like a prayer. Charlotte Hesse. She turned then, and for the first time since the dance, she looked directly at him. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, only that fragile space between two people who had shared something neither of them could explain. Then she said softly, "Danke." Jack didn't trust himself to speak. He only nodded. The whistle blew, the doors slammed shut. And then she was gone. The platform emptied, but he stood there long after the train disappeared down the track. The echo of the whistle lingered in his ears, fading like the end of a song. Somewhere in that sound, he could still hear the gramophone playing, the same rhythm, the same impossible grace of that night. The dance had lasted 4 minutes. The memory would last years. When Jack returned to the camp that evening, The gramophone still sat in the recreation hall, its brass horn dulled by dust. Someone asked him if he wanted to join the next music night. He shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I'm done dancing." And he was. For the rest of the war, the music never quite sounded the same. And long after the war was over, after the fences were pulled down and the barracks were stripped bare and sold for lumber, the music still lingered, in memory, in rumor, in the way stories survive even when their details are lost. The camp itself vanished, swallowed by fields and decades, leaving behind only a few dusty photographs in the local archives and a scattering of official reports in military storage. But the story of that night, the cowboy and the German girl, the forbidden dance beneath the fading light, refused to fade. It passed from mouth to mouth, stripped of names, but not of feeling. In veterans' halls and faded letters, in the pauses between stories that could be told and those that never could, the dance would reappear. Some remembered it clearly, the music, the tension, the hush that fell over the yard. Others claimed it never happened, or that it was exaggerated. "Just a slow shuffle," one man muttered years later, and the whole camp acted like they'd seen a ghost. Some laughed, brushing it off like a myth, a tall tale told to soften the edge of memory. But even they didn't deny it entirely, because denial wasn't the point. The story had become something more than an event. It had become a symbol. Local legend grew around it. In the nearby town, where old-timers still sat on porches sipping coffee in the early morning, someone would bring it up once every few years. "Did you ever hear about the guard who danced with a Nazi?" they'd say, voice low but not cruel. And someone else would shake their head and answer, "I heard it was just a girl. Just a kid." And that was the uncomfortable truth of it. The story never quite settled on what it meant. Was it an act of mercy, of foolishness, of rebellion? Or was it something no uniform could explain? A moment that reminded everyone watching that war doesn't strip away humanity, it only hides it. That was what lingered. Not the details, but the rupture, the crack in the narrative. Because soldiers are supposed to follow orders. Prisoners are supposed to obey. Men are not supposed to fall quiet at the sight of a woman in a foreign uniform swaying in rhythm with a boy from Texas. And yet, for those few minutes, the rules collapsed. Not with violence, not with shouting, but with music. And that made it harder to forget. The story lived because it unsettled, because it asked questions no one wanted to answer out loud. What happens when your enemy doesn't act like an enemy? What does it mean to see dignity in someone who was meant to represent everything you were fighting against? What if kindness, not cruelty, is the thing that challenges your loyalty most? Jack Harris never spoke about it after the war. He went home, ran cattle, raised a family. But his daughter found a photograph once, an old one, buried in a shoebox. On the back, in faint pencil, were the words, "Moonlight Serenade, 1945. No names, no location, just a memory caught in silver grain. She asked him once about it. He only said, "It was a long time ago," and left the room. And yet, the story refused to stay buried. It surfaced in memoirs, in oral histories collected by graduate students decades later, in podcasts and interviews where old men said, "There was this one time," always with a half-smile, always with a faraway look. No one had written it down officially. The reports made no mention of it. But the truth didn't live in reports. It lived in the silence that followed the music, in the breath people held when they saw it happen, in the way no one could ever quite forget. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these forgotten stories are reaching. If this story moved you or surprised you, go ahead and like this video and tap the subscribe button just below the player. Hit the notification bell too, so we can keep making more untold stories like this one, and you'll never miss when the next chapter drops. Thank you for being here, because this isn't just a story about a dance. It's about what dances break and what they leave behind. And some stories, no matter how small, refuse to die. Jack Harris never sought attention for what happened in that camp. When the war ended, he returned to Texas like so many others, quiet, sun-worn, changed. He didn't go into politics or write a memoir. He built a life that looked simple from the outside. A modest ranch near Lubbock, a pickup with more rust than paint, a porch swing that creaked in the wind. He married once, briefly. No children from that union. But he helped raise a niece, taught her how to ride, how to mend barbed wire, how to spot a rattler in the brush. He spoke about the war only when necessary. Names like Normandy or Bastogne never passed his lips. He avoided the reunions, the speeches, the parades. If someone asked, he'd offer a half answer, guarded a camp somewhere cold, and change the subject. He wasn't bitter, just quiet, like someone protecting a part of himself that no one else could understand. Years later, after his death, his niece was the one who cleaned out the house. She found a small wooden box in the attic, tucked beneath yellowing newspapers and old rodeo ribbons. Inside were a few medals, still polished, a worn photograph of Jack and his brothers, and then, folded neatly beneath the lid, a small wool blanket, gray, thin, fraying at the edges. It didn't look like much, except for the stitching in the corner. 2 letters, barely legible, L.H. She held it in her hands, confused. It wasn't military issue. It didn't match anything else in the box, but the way it had been folded, the care taken to preserve it, made her pause. It had meant something to him, this relic from another life. She never figured out the name. She tried, once, years later, to search through the old POW rosters, but there were too many women, too many blank records, too many stories lost in translation or time. But she kept the blanket, framed it behind glass, not for the name she couldn't find, but for the silence she now understood. And across the ocean, in a village near Dresden, another story quietly unfolded. Lotta, now an old woman with silver hair and slow steps, sat beside her granddaughter in the garden. The child had asked her once, innocently, if she had ever been to America. Lotta had paused, eyes drifting toward the hills in the distance, as if trying to decide which version of the truth to tell. Finally, she said, "Once an American danced with me." The girl blinked. "Like in a movie?" Lotta smiled, but it wasn't a smile of nostalgia. It was something quieter. "Not quite, but for 4 minutes I was not the enemy." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. That sentence, those few words, held more than any retelling ever could. The granddaughter remembered that story for the rest of her life. She told it to her children, and they told it to theirs. No names, no places, just the image of a woman once called a prisoner, and a man in uniform dancing under a foreign sky. Because some stories don't need to be recorded to survive. They move through families like heirlooms made of breath, and the smallest gestures, a hand extended, a blanket kept, a sentence whispered, become legacies that outlast even memory. War teaches us how to build walls, but sometimes it is the tiniest cracks in those walls that let the light through. And through that light, stories like this one continue to live. We think of war as thunder, as noise, as the deafening sound of artillery, the roar of engines overhead, the chaos of boots trampling mud beneath torn flags. We think of generals pointing at maps, of speeches, of treaties. We're taught to remember the victories, the defeats, the nations drawn and redrawn in ink. But war isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as a spoon being handed back, as still as a girl humming a tune over a pot of boiling potatoes, as human as a man in uniform asking a question he shouldn't ask, and a woman behind wire saying yes without words. There were front lines in this war that never made the newsreels, invisible ones, the emotional front lines, where uniforms clashed not in battle, but in belief, where enemy meant everything until it suddenly meant nothing at all. Jack and Lotta met on that front line. Their weapons were glances, their battlefield was a camp yard. Their truce came in the form of music played too softly to carry, but loud enough to rearrange the room. Propaganda told Jack she was dangerous, that she was part of the machine that had burned the world, that mercy toward her was weakness. And propaganda told Lotta that Americans were brutish occupiers, men who would treat her like dirt or worse. But then he called her ma'am, and she hummed while she worked, and everything those posters had tried to instill began to fray. That is how dignity works. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't throw bricks or start revolutions. It whispers. It holds the door open. It dances when no one is supposed to, and in doing so, it chips away at the grand lies that keep us at war. Dignity, when offered freely, does something protest often can't. It makes the enemy real. It collapses the distance. It forces you to look. The dance between Jack and Lotta didn't change the war. The maps didn't shift. The generals didn't take note. But it changed something. In the guards who watched. In the women who whispered about it in bunks. In Jack, who never danced again. In Lotta, who stitched her initials into a camp blanket she could never explain. That 4-minute moment rewrote the war, not on a grand scale, but on the scale that matters most, the human one. And that is why remembering the soft moments matters just as much as the loud ones, because history books will tell you who won, but it's stories like this that tell you what it cost, and sometimes what was saved. The war was never just guns. It was also soup ladles and scratched records and the letters that never got mailed. It was fear and rules and the breaking of both. It was two strangers raised on opposite sides of a catastrophe, finding a brief, impossible pause in the noise. They were not heroes. They were not even friends. But they saw each other. And in a world built to keep them apart, that seeing, that quiet acknowledgment, was a rebellion all its own. So when we talk about war, let's not forget the ones who didn't fight with weapons but with humanity. The ones whose stories don't end in parades, but in silence, in blankets, in memory. Because sometimes the most powerful act in a time of violence is simply refusing to forget that the person across from you is a person too. And if that's not a kind of victory, then perhaps we've misunderstood what victory means.